Frank Pasquale. You have the floor.
Thank you. So I'll just go right into my presentation if the technician is ready. But to preface it, I guess I would say that the key theme of my talk today is I want to pivot off of a comment that Amy made yesterday with respect to machine judgments, right? Because I don't mean literally that it's just machines judging people in these different financial contexts. There are people behind the machines, and a lot of what my talk will be about is how you ultimately want to regulate them. We're pivoting a bit as well from some very, I think, indisputably life-enhancing, world-enhancing AI in agricultural, driving, other contexts, to areas where AI is taking on roles of judgment, of deciding who's good, who's bad, who's a risk, who's not, et cetera. And that's where I want to raise some ethical questions. In a nutshell, one of my arguments today will be that automation has changed finance a lot, and it will continue to do so. But there are many forms of change now touted by technophiles. Could that be, I'm sorry, I'm in control. There we are. Can I have the presentation back? Sorry. Is it on? Sorry about that. There we go. Great. So, to come back to my second slide, right there. In a nutshell, basically what's going on is that the automation has changed finance profoundly and will continue to do so. But there's a real problem, I think, now in the futuristic discourse, because there's a lot of people who say that it's going to utterly change everything, and I think that that is incorrect. And I think there's a certain performativity of that where it's being driven by the vendors of the AI as opposed to people objectively evaluating it. So what I'm going to try to do in today's talk is to enrich the dialogue on AI with some perspectives from the algorithmic accountability movement. That's been a very important movement over the past 5 to 10 years. A group that does fairness, accuracy, and transparency, or fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning, emphasizing the role of professional judgment, and talking about how political all this can become and how it's properly political. Thinking about, first of all, credit data, and I'm going to start with the first 10 minutes on individual consumers and then talk about financial transactions in general. We've seen an evolution, as this chart shows from the Robinson and Yu study, Knowing the Score, where more and more data is becoming available to individuals and to credit grantors. We've moved from, for example, credit account information, the history of how well you pay your bills, to things like your utility payments, and now in many countries around the world, fringe alternative data, which includes things like people's social media score, their location data, when their phone is on, when it's off, when it's being used, when it's not being used, web tracking of them on all websites that they may visit. And this raises some really interesting and difficult questions about privacy, but before, as Henrik brought up yesterday, but before even getting into the privacy problems, I just want to ask one question just to follow up on a point on binarism that I made yesterday about the nature of training. You might remember that we learned yesterday, or we talked about how machine learning systems are given training and that said either something's good or bad, right? It's either a better environment or a worse one. One thing I wonder about is, if you have a loan that's coded by proprietary algorithms, if that loan goes to someone and say they do repay it, the lender makes a profit, but at enormous cost to the lender's or to the borrower's family and to the borrower, him or herself, is that coded a success? And what we have to realize is that every time a loan like that is coded as a success, we are training our machines to make more loans like that. And that's something we have to be quite worried about. I know that in Europe in particular, there are some, there's a sense of security around the GDPR in the sense that, and around other forms of regulation. But I want to get into how that might also be a false sense of security as well with respect to the privacy side. And that is thinking about what data is appropriate for these sorts of machine learning programs. So for example, there is a company in the US that will look at people's faces, and their basic principle here is that we all notice from, say, a high school reunion, some people age better than others. And the idea behind this company is that they can predict from, say, a large database of faces, mapping certain faces to people who died earlier than you expect, the type of face that might give away the propensity to die early, and that a life insurer may use that information, just reading off someone's face their propensity to have early mortality. Another example that was discovered by researchers at Microsoft was people using their mice. So you might know if you use a mouse online, not only is where you're clicking being recorded, but also how your tremors and movement as you move the mouse. And some researchers at Microsoft found that people that had certain micro tremors, indetectable to human beings, but detectable to computers, were very likely to search for Parkinson's disease 6 months later. Okay? So they had sort of a 6-month prediction of someone's likelihood to search for a given disease online. And you can imagine that is just the tip of the iceberg of what very large tech companies have, what Amy Webb calls the 9, Google, Microsoft, Apple, et cetera in America, and Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent in China. So you have potentially enormous amounts of data just from things like tremors of your hand while you're surfing the web. Another thing that's interesting, and here in terms of how we analyze data, is China recently developed a next generation AI development plan. And in this next generation plan, there was emphasis on things like facial recognition. Well, a company called Hanwang and another company called Hikvision took it upon themselves to promote this type of AI and facial recognition analysis in the classroom. And you may wonder what this has to do with finance. I'll come to that in just a second, but I just want to give the predicate for this first. What this system does is for children in the classroom, every second it takes a photo of them and then records that photo, parses the face for whether they're paying attention or not, whether they're happy or sad, disruptive or not, then gives a score to the students, moment by moment and then at the end of the day. And then the scores are aggregated per class, and then the classes are aggregated and ranked in a giant scoreboard in the school. This sort of system now affects at least thousands of children within China. It is, of course, it's not been adopted on a nationwide level. This is a pilot program. There was a small-scale protest on Weibo where children said, hashtag, thank God I graduated already. Those were people who had graduated and who weren't subject to the system. But I bring it up because already in many places around the world, there are systems that parse your voice and determine, for example, if you're interviewing for a job, whether you have a voice that's like the voice of people who are successful at the job. And this is, again, something that I think is quite worrisome and that I think that, things like the GDPR in Europe would stop. However, we may never learn about the practices because trade secrecy protections asserted by corporations may keep anyone from ever finding out that this stuff is being used. So that's just one thing I want to underline, is that if you are disturbed by anything I talk about today, we really need to be careful about trade secrecy that we afford to corporations because we may never find out about it. Already existing factors for credit provision include things like political activity. According to a report from Privacy International, if a lender sees political activity in someone's Twitter account in India, they will often consider repayment more difficult and not make the loan. This is also something that's potentially built into Sesame Credit and other aspects of the Chinese social credit scoring system. The other parts of the world, for example, in lesser developed countries, there might be a demand for the entire contents of a person's smartphone, including who they're calling, receiving messages from. Others are more in the form of looking at how you fill out a website. In some recent co-authored work, I've tried to classify these things as predatory, creepy, and subordinating financial inclusion. And what I mean by that is that financial inclusion is often seen as a good thing. We're bringing more people into the system. But sometimes it can be predatory, sometimes it can be creepy in the amount of data it demands, and sometimes it can subordinate people. If we tell people, if you get involved in politics, you don't get a loan, that is essentially telling poor people not to get involved in politics, which I think is very troubling. I would bring all this together by saying that there are many scholars working on what I would call a critical economics of exploitation. And they're trying to develop models of what is proper and what is not in terms of how far lenders and others can go to understand their customers. But one thing I would just moot and put out, and I know we were asked to do some provocations, and one provocation I would give is that once we reach a critical mass of demands for explainability, fairness, and non-discrimination in these areas, we may not be able to take a big data or AI approach. We may end up essentially reverting back from an AI-driven or machine learning-driven model of credit underwriting determinations to one that is more juridical in nature, where only a set established pattern or a set of criteria can be used to decide who gets credit or who does not. I haven't developed that fully in the paper, but I think it's certainly a possibility. Another aspect here is I just wanted to think about, we should think creatively about what could happen once these systems get a bit out of control. And what this is a cartoon by a engaged journalist named Susie Cagle, where she imagines a future where your credit score could be determined, your ability to get credit could be determined in part by the scores of your friends. So she's imagining a future where someone that needs to get a small business loan decides that they need to no longer be friends with people with low scores. Okay. And this sort of spiderweb effect of people's score being affected by who they hang out with or who they are socializing with, that I think we have to worry about as well, right? Because that, again, is a prelude to an algorithmically driven caste system where you understand your score in the system is being dependent on who you associate with, and you're incentivized there not to associate with people with low scores. That, I think, is yet another problem we need to think about. Now, I'm going to talk about something very different, right? So the first part of my paper talked about the individual level problem. The second part, I'm going to talk about something that's a bit more abstract, but I think is really worth discussing when we think about the limits of machine learning and computation, which is, can we develop systems that sort of automate financial relationships? And I began with the work of Henry Hu, who has advised the American Securities and Exchange Commission about the possibility that contemporary finance has become too complex to depict. And if that's a problem, and if we think that that is an issue, we have to be really worried about any system that sort of is premising financial regulation on disclosure, because we may be setting ourselves up for a fall if we assume that we can disclose all the risks involved in a credit system. And I think we learned in 2008 about how difficult that can be. I've evolved on this issue. In my book, Black Box Society, I looked at a number of very complex financial practices in the global economy. And what I tried to do in that book was to promote efforts to make the financial system more legible by including things like legal entity identifiers, making sure that every financial instrument in the world had a number on it, okay, that could be cataloged somewhere. The Office of Financial Research in the US was another thing that I promoted. Open Corporates Group, which is a nonprofit group trying to keep track of every corporation in the world. I thought that would all be very helpful things. However, what I found was that as I interviewed more and more people from these offices, they started to give me the sense that this was an impossible task, that you probably never could get legal entity identifiers that could classify all financial relationships, within a given economy. That with respect to open corporates, they're trying very hard, but there are just so many ways in which if you want to hide what you're doing, you can create a shell company that owns other shell companies, that owns other shell companies. And that's what led me to my work in a recent article called A Rule of Persons, Not Machines, where I tried to emphasize that we really have to recognize the limits of efforts to use AI and machine learning to make the financial system more transparent, because there are very complex finance systems and unpredictable politics that determine, for example, who gets paid and who does not get paid in the event of bankruptcy or other issues like that. And Caterina Pastor's work is very good on that as well. And so I think that this is, emphasizing these limits is important. Oops. I would also say that with respect to, this is going to require a bit of a sea change with the way in which regulators are operating, because a lot of regulators within the US and abroad, in the UK, in Europe, are thinking about how you could develop a system where you could mandate algorithmic descriptions for derivatives, for example, and try to reduce contracts into code. And while I do think there are many promising applications for statutes and, for example, the tax code to be reduced to a computational system, I think that in many areas of finance, we should be very cautious about encouraging the reduction of these derivatives into code, because there are many ways in which the code cannot anticipate the messiness of human financial relationships, of contracts, of how court systems will operate, et cetera. Moving on a bit, this fits into a larger debate about the nature of technology, where on the one side you have books like The Rise of the Robots and Humans Need Not Apply, which are books that really emphasize the substitution of machines for human beings. And on the other, you have scholars who emphasize the infirmities of computing systems that are not robustly backed up by human beings, including people like Lucy Suchman, who's analyzed human-machine interaction, Sophia Noble, who's focused on Google, but I think a lot of her work is more generally applicable, and on Nicholas Carr's The Glass Cage, which really, I think, nicely anticipated the problems with the Boeing 737 MAX. It was written a few years ago, but he talked to people who were in aviation and worried about the problems that would be caused by automation. And sort of my theme is that the folks on the one side who are emphasizing the fragility of these systems are quite smart to do so. I'd also say that, with respect to the blockchain, since everyone talks about blockchain and it's a very topical issue, I think the futurist version of this is something that, say, is public and permissionless. And what that means is that, anyone could join a blockchain system and could try to develop their own financial transactions on it. But I think that this is more likely to have success in what is known as an incrementalist, private, and permissioned way, where actually existing financial institutions use the technology to smooth out and to accelerate their own transactions, but they aren't necessarily disrupted by it. Okay, and I think that's a difference to the narrative, because I think a lot of people think that there will be just disruption of the financial system by blockchain. I don't think that's the case. I actually think the case is that we're going to see a lot more emphasis on large corporations using it. I just will skip, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the next slide, which is from a paper that I wrote about where we want to regulate these systems and where we want to let them run free. But I'll go more to something that I think is a more dramatic example of where the politics of this is all heading. And just coming back to the underwriting concerns. We had a recent controversy in the US where we have discussions over credit scoring about the ability of people to get credit and how they're scored. And Lawrence Summers, who's our former Treasury Secretary, is very enthusiastic about the ability of proprietary secret algorithms to assess creditworthiness. So this will expand access to credit. But Derek Hamilton is an economist who said that we really should nationalize these scores, because what they end up often doing is reinforcing cycles of disadvantage, where people who have certain problems end up having more problems with things that get scored by the scorers, and that in turn feeds into worse scores, and it becomes a vicious cycle. And he thinks that we have to republicize them. And I bring up this conflict because I think it's anticipating something that's going to be happening deep in finance, and it shows something about the nature of social science, about its contestability. And I had a very good conversation yesterday about the contestability of social science. We can either, I think, take a more functionalist approach to this sort of finance and think about the positive sum cooperation involved in the use and deployment of AI. But as we do so, we also have to keep in mind conflict theory that talks about the problems here in terms of class, race, and gender conflict, that there can be struggle for positional advantage, that there can be zero-sum conflicts that are accelerated by, say, scoring systems and AI. And as we reason together about these sort of systems, we can add another layer here too, which is methodological individualism, methodological holism. And I can't get into the full details here, the paper does a bit more. But what I think is critical here to think about is that with respect to the functionalist theories and conflict theories, I've tried to give a part 4 approach here, where I look at some of the groups that are disadvantaged by these systems and how we can reform and regulate them to make a more positive contribution to finance and to make sure that we aren't just replaying the past into the future. Because that's always a worry about machine learning systems, is that if they're using a certain set of data from the past, they're just going to be replaying that into the future. If you try to find the voices of the best employees, for example, or the best credit risk from what you gave in the past, you may end up just doing what you did in the past without really thinking about why those advantages were accrued in the past. And I think without that sort of regulation, the unsavory alternative is that you have one profession to rule them all, right? And I think that this is a theme of my book from a few years ago, The Black Box Society, is that if you have a technical argument that finance is just reproducible to data patterns that are reproducible by machines, that means that essentially that you can knock out, say, the professions of accounting, law, other professions. And I think ultimately they have a very critical role to play. And I do know that many of the regulations that I've either implied or called for in the paper will raise the cost here. Oh, sorry, I lost track there. this is that many of the regulations that I have called for will raise the cost here. But I think that if they raise the cost in some areas, they will ultimately drive talent and ability to some other areas, and I think that that is a good thing, that ultimately that we might want to have more, a bit more friction in credit systems and a bit more sort of regulation and human judgment, and that might lead to, say, there being more investment in some other fields where some of these issues do not come up so much. And finally, I'll just say that my closing thoughts here are that I'm working on sort of these methodological approaches in a group called the Association to Promote Political Economy and Law. I think that taking a normative stance here on the AI revolution is really important for professionals. And please do keep in touch, because I'd love to think further beyond this workshop about these issues. So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.